few weeks ago, I was having a chat with someone that I know through the caravan dinners across the road. And in the course of this chat, this person said to me that they thought that the belief that there is a God is just ridiculous. Just ridiculous, they said. I thought, okay. I said, why do you believe that? And they said, well, a lot of bad things have happened in my life and to people who are close to me, and I just can't reconcile that with the idea that there is a God who controls everything, who's sovereign and who's good. I just can't reconcile those things together. And I think the truth of the matter is that when life doesn't go so well for us, we can indeed question God. We can question, God, are you actually really in control of everything right now? Are you actually acting in a way which is good as I go through these things right now? And for some people, those situations, like with this friend of mine, lead them to believe there must not be a God. Well, this morning we're starting a brand new series of sermons on the book of Daniel. We're focusing in particular today on Daniel chapter 1. And what we learn from Daniel 1 is this. There is a God. He is sovereign. He is in control of all things. And he is good. That's what we learn. There is a God. He is sovereign. And he is good. And so as we look at Daniel 1 today, we're going to see how that's the case. But we're not just going to focus on Daniel 1. We're also going to focus on the death of Jesus. Because as we look at the death of Jesus, we also see that God is very much in control of all things, and he is indeed good. But friends, as we learn from Daniel 1 and from the death of Jesus about the fact that there is a God, that he is sovereign, and that he is good, we're not learning these things just so we can sort of sit there and go, oh, well, that's all well and good, and walk off and have it make no difference to our lives. No, the purpose of us learning these things is that we might trust in this God who does exist, who is sovereign and who is good, and that we might be willing to live for him, no matter how hard it might be to do so in this world. And indeed, we're going to see it was very difficult for Daniel and his friends to do exactly that. And so with all that in mind, let's now dive into Daniel 1, what it says about the fact that there is a God who is sovereign and who is good. This brings us to our first point, which is that God delivered King Jehoiakim of Judah into the hand of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in 605 BC. So in Daniel 1, 1-2, we read, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put them in the treasure house of his God. So the third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim, according to Hebrew calendars, is 605 BC. 605 BC. So some 2,600 years ago. And Jehoiakim was king over Judah. And in case you don't know what Judah was the southern kingdom of Israel. So Israel was at one point a united kingdom, but in 931 BC, around then, it split into two, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. And in 722 BC, the kingdom of Israel in the north was no more after the Assyrians took it over and deported all of the people out of the land. And so at this point in Israel's history, you've just got Judah, ruled over by Jehoiakim, and the people of Judah were known as Israelites. But at that time, in 605 BC, we see that Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, just to help you to know where these places are, so we've got a map up here on the screen. So you've got Jerusalem, located in Israel, what we call Israel today. Babylon, which is located in today what we call Iraq. It's about 870 kilometres as the crow flies between the two, or a 1,450 kilometre walking journey back in those days. Around about 4 months to travel between the two places. And you might be wondering, why would Nebuchadnezzar bother to go so far so as to besiege Jerusalem? Well, Babylon was the big superpower of the day. And what do superpowers like to do? They like to spread the length of their power, the length of their influence. That's what they like to do. And that's what Nebuchadnezzar was doing at that time. And we see that Nebuchadnezzar prevails against Jehoiakim and Jerusalem. Notice what happens in verse 2 as a result of Nebuchadnezzar's prevailing. He actually goes into the temple of God and takes articles from the temple of God out. And he takes these particular articles from the temple of God and takes them to the temple of his own God in Babylon. Now, friends, remember that back in these days, all the different nations had their own gods. Okay, they had their own gods. The people of Israel had their God, the one true God, the God that we read about in the Bible. Okay, all the other gods were make-believe, but all the other nations had their own gods. And in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, his victory over Jehoiakim was a victory of his God over Israel's God. And so the taking of articles from the temple was his way of symbolizing that victory. Taking them back to the temple of his God, a way of symbolizing that in his mind, his God had prevailed over Israel's God. But we see that the reality was that that was nothing of the sort at all. Because notice the start of verse 2, it was the Lord who delivered Jehoiakim into the hand of King Nebuchadnezzar. It was the one true God, the God of Israel, who controls all things, who is sovereign, who actually enabled King Nebuchadnezzar to be victorious on this occasion. So what happens here in Daniel 1 is not a story of God somehow losing control. No, God was very much in control of all that happened. God was very much in control. And it wasn't just articles from the temple that ended up in Babylon. Have a look at what verses 3 to 4a tell us. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. Nebuchadnezzar, for good measure, also takes all the future leaders of Judah away. The good-looking ones that people would be inclined to follow, those who are smart, those who are from the upper classes, the royal family, from nobility, those who would be Judah's future leaders are removed, forcibly taken from Jerusalem, 4-month journey away to Babylon, where they were to serve the king of Babylon. Now at this point we could sort of say, okay, God's in control, but it doesn't sound like a very good thing that happens to these young potential leaders in Judah. It doesn't sound like a very nice thing that they would be removed forcibly from their homeland, taken to a land that was not their own to serve a king who was not their own. Was God being good as he allowed this to happen? Was God being good? Well, friends, to answer that question, we need to go back and look at the Old Testament a little bit wider, look at Israel's history. We need to go back to a bit over 800 years before the events listed here in Daniel 1. Remember that God rescued the people of Israel at the time of Moses from slavery in the land of Egypt. He brought them out of the land, promised to give them a new land, and in the course of all of that, God entered into a covenant with the people of Israel, an agreement with them. God promised that he would be their God. They would be his people. And as a part of the covenant, God gave them good laws to live by, laws that were actually for their benefit. And God made it clear in the book of Deuteronomy, just before the people entered the land, that if they kept his laws and lived with him as God, they would be blessed. But he also made it clear that if they didn't keep his laws, that there would be consequences. And in Deuteronomy 28 verses 58 and 63b, we read this: "If you do not carefully follow all the words of this law which are written in this book, and do not revere this glorious and awesome name, the Lord your God, it will please him to ruin and destroy you. You will be uprooted from the land you are entering to possess." Now in Deuteronomy 28, there's a number of different curses which are spoken about when it comes to what would happen if the people of Israel disobeyed God. But notice this one: cast out of the land that God had given to them. Now, friends, after the people enter into the land, what happens? Well, when it came to obeying God, they weren't very good. They continually disobeyed God time and time again, to the point where they were actually worshipping the gods of other nations. And I want you to read about what the prophet Jeremiah had to say to the people of Israel, to the people of Judah, shortly before Nebuchadnezzar came to Babylon. We read, "And though the Lord has sent all his servants, the prophets, to you again and again, you have not listened or paid any attention. They said, 'Turn now, each of you, from your evil ways and your evil practices, and you can stay in the land the Lord gave to you and your ancestors forever and ever. Do not follow other gods to serve and worship them. Do not arouse my anger with what your hands have made, then I will not harm you.'" Notice here, what does God do? Over an 800-odd year period, he shows great patience, and time again, he warns his people through the prophets of their need to stop sinning. He even offers forgiveness here. He even says, if you turn back to me, you can stay in the land, you and your descendants after you, right? God is being very patient, very gracious with this people who are rebelling against him, despite all the good that he had done for them. But notice this: "You did not listen to me, declares the Lord, and you have aroused my anger with what your hands have made," that is, these idols that they were worshipping, "and you have brought harm to yourselves." God had warned them, offered to forgive them, but they would not listen. They would not change. And so verses 8 to 9 spell out the consequences. "Therefore the Lord Almighty says this: because you have not listened to my words, I will summon all the peoples of the north and my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, declares the Lord, and I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants and against all the surrounding nations." The reason why Nebuchadnezzar comes to Babylon in 605 BC and removes that generation of young leaders is because the people of Israel had sinned. This is not a sign that God was not good. No, God had shown lots of patience. God had said in the covenant, if you disobey my covenant, there will be curses. And so God was acting in an entirely right and good way as he allowed Nebuchadnezzar to have victory. And here's the tragedy of it all. Even after this foray from Nebuchadnezzar in 605 BC, do you think God's people in Judah learned? Do you think they heeded the warning? No, they kept on sinning. 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar comes back again, takes the ruling classes away. Do you think that the people learned after that? No, they kept on sinning. In 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar comes for the third time, destroys Jerusalem, and takes off the people with the exception of the very poor. God's people lose in Daniel 1. But it's not because God was somehow lost control or because God was somehow not good. No, God was thoroughly in control. And in everything he did, he was thoroughly good. It's interesting, as I was talking with my friend from Carevan, and they told me about how ridiculous it is to believe in God, given that bad things happen to people in life. I said to him in response, I said, I think you've made an assumption which is wrong. And he said, what do you mean? I said, I think you assume that you deserve to have God treat you well. But the Bible says that's a wrong assumption. And it's a wrong assumption because, like the Israelites, we have all sinned. That's why bad things happen in the world. That's why ultimately there is death in this world. Now, friends, can I be very, very clear that this doesn't mean that if you're going through a really, really bad time, it's because you've been really, really bad, and if someone else isn't going through such a bad time, they're less bad. No, no, no. That's karma. The Bible doesn't teach karma. In fact, you read a book like Job, and we learn there's mystery in life as to why some go through harder things than others. There's mystery. We just don't know why. But friends, the truth of the matter is we live in a fallen world. We will all face death because we have turned our backs on our Maker. But here's the thing, just as God warned the people of Israel time and time again to turn back to him, just as God warned them about their need to turn back to him and that he would forgive them, otherwise there'd be punishment, so God continues to warn us today in his word. And forgiveness is possible through Jesus. Friends, when bad things happen to us, it's not that God has lost control. It's not that God is not good. No, he's always in control. He's always sovereign. He's always good. We are the problem. And he graciously warns us and provides a way for us to be forgiven. We need to listen to that warning and learn from the people of Israel who failed to do so. So we see in those first few verses of Daniel 1, there is a God who is sovereign, who is good. And we see these things also very much playing out as we look at what happens to Daniel and his friends when they ended up in Babylon. This brings us to our next point, which is that the king of Babylon attempted to mould those he captured from Jerusalem so they would take on Babylonian ways. So look at verses 4b to 5. He was to teach them, Ashpenaz, the chief official, was to teach them, the young Israelite leaders, the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. So notice what would happen to these young men over a 3-year period. They were to learn the Babylonian language. They were no longer to speak their own language. They were now to learn the Babylonian language and to start speaking that. Notice that they're no longer to be sort of learning from God's word, learning from the scriptures, learning from the things of Israel. They're now to spend their time learning from Babylonian literature. Notice too that the king wants them to eat from his table. Now, have you heard of Michelin-starred restaurants? You know, they're the restaurants that are above all others. You know, they cost a bomb too, but apparently they've got the best food. Well, this was the Michelin-star food back in Babylon. Okay? This was the best of the best that you could have. And I take it that what's going on here is that the king's not just trying to brainwash them by getting them to learn a different language and focus on sort of Babylonian literature. He's also trying to seduce them into thinking that life in Babylon is far better than life in Israel because the food here is much, much better. Things are so much better here in Babylon than back in Israel. And the whole idea is he's trying to get them so that they stop thinking like Israelites and stop desiring to be Israelites and instead to focus on being Babylonian and to serve the king. Have a look at how this program of moulding continues in verses 6 to 7. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah Abednego. And it's at this point that we see the strong intent of the Babylonians to cause these Israelites to forget their religious identity. Because all of these names have meanings. Daniel means God is my judge. Hananiah means Yahweh, the name of God, has been gracious. Mishael, who is what God is. And Azariah, Yahweh has helped. And so here we have these young Israelites who have been given names that refer to their God. But the Babylonians don't want that. So Daniel was renamed Belteshazzar, which means Bel, protect his life, Bel being a chief Babylonian god. Hananiah was renamed Shadrach, which means command of Aku, Aku being a Babylonian moon god. Mishael was renamed Meshach, who is what Aku is. Remember, his name was who is what God is. Now it's who is what Aku is. And Azariah was renamed Abednego, servant of Nego, a variation of Nabu, the Babylonian god of wisdom and writing. And so here we see, what's the strong encouragement here? Leave behind the God of Israel and now embrace the gods of Babylon. So what is essentially going on here is this process of brainwashing and seduction to convince these guys to leave behind the ways of Israel, their God, and instead to embrace the ways of Babylon and to serve the king of Babylon. Now, friends, Babylon is no ordinary place. Shinar is another name for it. You know, in the book of Genesis, the Tower of Babel, that's Shinar, that's Babylon. And in Genesis, with the tower, they're wanting to make a name for themselves as opposed to God. Babylon in the Bible, friends, is the place, the city, which symbolises rebellion against God. And so what we have here is a situation where the king of Babylon, the king who rules over the evil empire, is trying to get people to move away from the ways of God and instead to embrace the ways of sin. And do we not see that happen in our world today? Do we not, as the people of God, find ourselves continually bombarded by different things that are trying to influence us to move away from the things of God and instead to embrace the things of the world? Do we not see that? One example, and there are lots of examples I can give, but one example is over the last 40 or 50 years, there have been LGBTIQA+ activists who have been working very, very consistently to a strategy to try and normalise things like same-sex relationships, gender transitions. Not just to normalise it, also to celebrate such things and to cancel those who refuse to celebrate such things. That is an attempt through universities, through corporations, even in schools, to try and get people to move away from seeing what God thinks is good to thinking that something else totally opposite is good. And that's why, friends, we've got to keep our minds soaked in God's word. Because there are lots of things in the world that are trying to influence us to move away from living the life that God would have us live. Lots of things. That's why we've got to keep meeting together and encouraging one another to keep standing firm as followers of Jesus, to keep living Jesus' way, because there are so many messages out there in the world that are trying to move us away from the things of God. And so how did Daniel and his mates go? Well, what we see is that God blessed Daniel's resolve not to defile himself. See that Daniel resolved not to defile himself, that is, make himself unclean before God with the royal food and wine. There's something about eating this royal food, drinking the royal wine, which in Daniel's mind causes him to think will make him unclean somehow before God. Now, why would it make him unclean before God? Well, commentators argue about all this sort of stuff. I've seen 9 different options at least as to what it might be. But again, I think it might just be this. Remember, I think that the giving of the royal food and the wine to these young Israelites was a way of trying to seduce them to see that the ways of Babylon were good, far better than the ways that they used to live. And I take it that Daniel saw this trick for what it was. An attempt to try and to get him to leave behind what he valued as an Israelite and to embrace the life of Babylon. And he's like, you might change my name, you might force me to do work, you might force me to read different things, you might force me to speak a different language, but I'm not going to embrace being a Babylonian. I'm not going to do it. Because that would make me unclean before God. And so Daniel makes this choice. He wants to stand firm as one of God's people. He doesn't want to be seduced into a type of life that would steer him away from that, so he resolves to stand firm on this matter. Can I say this is not a chapter which advocates vegetarianism or veganism or things like that, despite what some people think. And apparently there was a book that was published once called The Daniel Diet, which was all about vegetarianism. It's not about that. Okay? And we see that Daniel asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now that could be a dangerous thing to do, couldn't it? Because who wanted them eating this raw food and wine and drinking that wine? The king. You go against the king of Babylon, you're in trouble, right? But notice, God's in control. God had caused the official to show favour and compassion to Daniel. When Daniel raises this, the official doesn't say, off with his head. No, the official is open to it, but he's scared too, because we read he's worried that if Daniel and his friends look less healthy than the others, that it will be off with his head. But Daniel manages to convince a guard to accept a trial. 10 days, we'll just eat vegetables only, not the raw food and wine. We'll just eat vegetables only. And if we look bad and haggard, if we look worse than the others, we'll eat the raw food, we'll drink the raw wine. But if we look all right, we want to stay on that. And the guard agreed. And what happens in the trial? Well, at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the raw food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. Here again, God's sovereignty is at play. God blesses Daniel and his friends in their resolve not to be seduced by Babylon. He blesses them by enabling them to be healthy on this diet. Friends, I take it God will bless us as we resolve to live for him. Okay? He knows when we resolve to live for him. Let's keep doing that. And what we also see is that God helped Daniel and his friends to stand out from their contemporaries. Look at verse 17. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. So notice God is at work again. Good God is at work helping Daniel and his friends as they're going through Babylonian school to learn things. And notice this great skill that Daniel develops to understand visions and dreams of all kinds. Next week we're going to see why that came in so handy. And what's the result of God's work, giving them knowledge and understanding in these ways? At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. Notice God's work in the life of Daniel and his friends, growing them in knowledge and understanding, giving them great skills and abilities, caused them to stand out from everyone. And the result is they enter into the king's service. And what we're going to see as we keep looking at the book of Daniel is this: that God deliberately wanted Daniel and his friends in the king's service, because it would be as they worked in the king's service that there would be opportunities for Daniel and his friends to testify to the one true God. The one true God who is above all others. See, the interesting thing here, friends, is that God doesn't remove Daniel and his friends from this situation. No, they are in that situation for a reason, so that through them, the one true God could be known above all of these other false gods. And friends, God doesn't remove us from the situations that we are in either. We're not called to sort of build monasteries and to separate ourselves from the world. We are called to be in the world. And we can learn about the different things that the world thinks. We can learn other languages. We can do all that sort of stuff. And God can actually use those things. He can actually equip us so that we can declare His greatness in the world around us. And indeed, that's what we're called to do, isn't it? We're called to be in the world, helping to make disciples for Jesus, helping people to see the goodness of Jesus and all that He has done for them. And so Daniel and his friends are put in this position by God, equipped by God, so they can declare the glory of God. And we'll hear more about that in weeks to come. But the last thing I just want to highlight in terms of God's goodness towards Daniel particularly is that Daniel ended up outlasting the Babylonian Empire. So notice that we read, and Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. And the first year of King Cyrus was 539, 538 BC. So nearly 70 years after Daniel first went to Babylon. And Cyrus was not a Babylonian. Cyrus was a Persian. Because the first year of King Cyrus was the first year of the end of the Babylonian Empire. Remember, it was Babylon who had taken Daniel captive, Babylon who had tried to shape and mould Daniel. But friends, one of the things that the book of Daniel teaches us is that God raises up kings and kingdoms, and He also brings them down. And God enabled Daniel to outlast his captors. The other significant thing about the first year of Cyrus, as we read in 2 Chronicles 36, 22 to 23, and Ezra 1, 1 to 4, is that in the first year of Cyrus, those who had been taken into exile were allowed to go back home, just as God had promised would be the case. God enabled Daniel, because He's in control of all things and because He's good, God enabled Daniel to stand firm for Him in a hostile environment. And friends, we can be assured too that God will enable us to stand firm as His people, no matter how hostile the environment is that we face. God blessed Daniel, and we see at the end of the book of Daniel, Daniel is given the hope of resurrection. And we too have the hope of resurrection as followers of Jesus because of what we learn about in our final point. And that is that we see God's sovereignty and goodness clearly displayed in the death of Jesus. Now in Acts chapter 4, which was read for us earlier on, we have the believers praying to God, seeing the threat of persecution. The Jewish religious leaders have just told Peter and John not to speak in the name of Jesus. And notice what they pray, first of all, in verse 27. Herod and Pontius Pilate met together with the Gentiles and the people of Israel in this city to conspire against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed. So notice, they're talking about the death of Jesus here. Why did Jesus' death happen? Well, Herod and Pontius Pilate, conspiring with Jews and Gentiles, they made it happen. Notice how Jesus is described here. He's described as God's anointed one, God's holy servant. And on the surface, you could sort of look at this and think, oh no, did God fail to protect his anointed one, to protect his holy servant? Just in the same way, people could question, did God fail when Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem? Did God fail? Well, friends, it wasn't a failure on God's part because God is in control. God is sovereign. Because notice what verse 28 says, they did what your power and will had decided beforehand should happen. So just as God used Nebuchadnezzar to fulfill his purposes in judgment against Jerusalem, so God used these different people to bring about his will for Jesus to die. But you might think, why would God want Jesus to die? Well, if you go back 700 years to the time of the prophet Isaiah, we see why. In Isaiah 53, verses 5 to 6, a passage which is pointing to Jesus. Isaiah is told about a servant. And this servant would be pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Why did God send Jesus to die? Well, he sent him to take our punishment. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Why did Jesus do that? So that through him being punished, we could have peace. Peace with God. Through him being wounded, we could be healed. Healed for all of eternity. You see, when Jesus died on the cross, it wasn't God losing control. No, it was God's will to save sinners being brought to bear. But you might think, but why did Jesus have to die for us to have peace with God and for us to be healed for eternity? Why didn't God just say, I forgive you? Well, Romans 3 tells us why. God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. He did this to demonstrate his righteousness because in his forbearance, he had left the sins committed beforehand, that is in Old Testament times, unpunished. He did it to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. Why did Jesus die? Well, it was God's way of demonstrating his righteousness. God's way of demonstrating that he is just. Friends, we hate it, don't we, when we watch the news and we hear about someone who deserves to be punished, getting off on some kind of technicality? Don't we hate that? We say, that's unjust. That should not happen. Why doesn't the government do something about this? We hate it. Well, friends, remember, we are all like sheep who have gone astray. We all deserve punishment from God. If God was just to say, I forgive you, and not do anything about the punishment we deserve, he would be unjust. He would not be good. No, Jesus comes and dies so we can have forgiveness, so we can be justified or right with God. But Jesus died to show that God is just when he forgives us. You see, when you look at the death of Jesus, what do you see? There is a God, and he's in control. The enemies of Jesus are used by God to fulfill his purposes. And what do we see? The death of Jesus highlights that God is good. Even to the point of allowing his one and only Son to die in our place so that justice would be done. So what do we learn from Daniel 1? What do we learn from the death of Jesus? There is a God. He is sovereign. He's in control of everything. and he's good. That's what we learn. There is a God. He is sovereign. He is good. And as we learn that, the purpose of learning that is not just so we go, oh, well, that's nice, and then just go away and totally forget about it and not have it impact upon us. No. The purpose of us learning is so that we might trust in this God through the good and the bad times. And so that we might live for him, no matter how hard it is to do so. God's in control. God is good. Daniel knew that. And what did he do? He kept trusting in God. And he kept living for God, no matter how hard it was to do so. And God blessed him. And let me assure you, friends, as we keep trusting in the God who is sovereign and who is good, as we keep living for him, we can expect that he too will bless us. That doesn't mean life will be easy, but he will indeed bless us. And so I'm going to give you a couple of moments now to think about one big thing that you've learned from all of that. And let me encourage you to share that with one another and encourage one another to keep remembering that there is a God who is sovereign and who is good, and to encourage one another to keep trusting in him and living for him.